January 17, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Before dawn, the cold lay over the prairie like hammered steel. Frost held to the barbed wire. The guard towers stood in the darkness with their windows faintly lit, and from the kitchens came a smell so out of place that it almost felt insulting to men who had crossed an ocean in defeat. Warm bread, black coffee, and fish lifted from a tin and laid over toast while the stoves hissed and the enamel trays clicked against one another. In the officers' compound, German uniforms, now stripped of power but not yet of habit, moved toward breakfast through frozen dirt and boot smoke. They had expected prison to smell of damp straw, old soup, and punishment. Instead, one tray appeared with toast carrying pale salmon, steam lifting off it in the winter air as if somebody had made a mistake and served a home instead of a prison. That small meal mattered because it landed in the middle of one of the strangest reversals of the war. By 1945, the United States would hold more than 425,000 prisoners of war in over 700 camps, most of them German. At the end of May 1945 alone, official totals recorded 371,683 Germans, 50,273 Italians, and 3,915 Japanese in American custody. Many of the first large German contingents had been taken in North Africa, where the collapse of the Axis position sent tens of thousands into Allied hands, and eventually across the Atlantic to a country most of them knew only through propaganda, rumor, and fantasy. The men who stepped into that Kansas morning had not been taught to fear American hunger. They had been taught to despise American softness. Nazi propaganda had worked on them for years with the same themes. Democracies were weak, commerce made men decadent, abundance made them cowardly, and America itself was a distant machine of money, jazz, race mixture, and moral collapse. Some German prisoners had even believed the Luftwaffe had smashed American cities. In their imagination, New York was blackened masonry, Chicago a scar, and the Republic itself a paper facade ready to split under pressure. A prison in such a land, they thought, would either be cruelly theatrical or humiliatingly cheap. It would be ration broth, old bread, and insult. Instead, many of them encountered the first crack in that mental wall before they ever reached camp. They crossed America by train, looking out at a continent untouched by the fire they had known in Europe. One former prisoner remembered pressing his face to the window as the train rolled through Kentucky and Virginia, and wrote that the first impression was the abundance of automobiles everywhere. It was not a battlefield fact. It was not even a military fact. It was a civilizational fact. A nation that could fill roads with cars while also moving armies across oceans was not living inside the categories they had been given. That is why the salmon toast on the tray carried more force than its modest appearance suggested. It was not luxury in any grand sense. It was not caviar, nor roast goose, nor a banquet under silver. It was ordinary American sufficiency. White bread, fish, hot coffee, and a kitchen that worked. Yet in wartime, ordinary abundance can feel more disorienting than spectacle. Starving man can dismiss a feast as propaganda. It is harder to dismiss the daily fact that even breakfast arrives intact. Camp Concordia itself had risen quickly out of the American interior, one of the many purpose-built worlds of captivity that appeared across the United States. Open from May 1st, 1943 to November 8th, 1945, it eventually held more than 4,000 Germans. The site contained more than 300 buildings, including barracks, a hospital, kitchens, and support structures, planted in farm country, where prisoner labor could be used and where escape promised mostly distance, weather, and disappointment. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, the United States was bound to treat prisoners humanely, and American authorities also had a practical motive for following those rules. German hands held American prisoners in Europe. Official policy required adequate food, sanitation, clothing, and medical care, and in principle, the rations and services were to be comparable to those given American troops. For officers, there were further distinctions. They were not required to work, and their quarters and courtesies reflected rank in ways that now seem almost surreal beside the brutal imagery most people associate with wartime imprisonment. Officers of higher rank could have orderlies. Majors and above might receive separate living spaces. Generals, individual huts. It was not freedom. But it was not the dungeon these men had imagined. And so, on that winter morning in Kansas, the officers studied the tray as if it might reveal a hidden mechanism. The toast was warm. The salmon had been spread or piled over it in a way that seemed both casual and excessive. Bread alone would have been one thing. Bread and fish suggested choice. Choice was what unnerved them. Choice belonged to civilian life. Choice belonged to peacetime. Choice belonged to the world they had been told democracies could no longer sustain. On the German home front, the war had been eating the table for years. On many fronts, the Wehrmacht survived on fatigue and dwindling supply. Men had known black bread, weak coffee, thin soup, ersatz fat, and the slow educational power of never having enough. One German prisoner later wrote, "Here we eat more in a single day than during a whole week at home." Another journal entry described meals with almost incredulous precision, as if the act of listing them might prove they were real. The surprise was not merely that the food existed, it was that it existed consistently. That consistency began to work on the prisoners the way weather works on stone. A single meal shocks. Repetition transforms. Day after day, the coffee remained hot. Day after day, bread appeared. Day after day, the kitchens did not collapse into the logic of scarcity they had come to regard as normal. In some camps, prisoners could buy canteen items with camp scrip, candy, cigarettes, toiletries, soft drinks, sometimes even low-alcohol beverages. Men who had crossed the Atlantic, expecting punitive deprivation, instead found themselves in a system capable of feeding, clothing, and medically treating the enemy at scale. The salmon toast became, in memory, the right symbol for that discovery. Not because it was a famous meal. It was not. Not because historians can point to a single preserved menu card and say, "Here, this was the exact breakfast that changed them." They cannot. But because it contains the contradiction at the heart of the experience. Fish on toast is a small thing, yet in a prison camp in wartime, served to captured officers of a defeated army, it becomes something larger. Proof that power can express itself through restraint, that a democracy can make even ordinary food feel ideological. At first, the officers did what defeated officers always do when reality offends their training. They intellectualized. They told themselves this was a performance arranged for inspection. They suggested that the Americans were feeding them for photographs, or for Swiss observers, or so that letters home might weaken morale inside Germany. There was some basis for that suspicion. Swiss representatives did inspect camps. Mail was monitored. And even prisoners themselves sometimes hesitated to describe camp abundance to families, fearing that their letters might be copied and used to encourage German surrender. But propaganda has a shelf life when it cannot explain repetition. It can explain a staged day. It cannot easily explain a month. It can explain one good meal. It cannot easily explain a kitchen that continues to function while Europe burns. The officers kept receiving food. They kept seeing trucks, warehouses, medical facilities, laundry, soap, and a bureaucracy whose bland efficiency was more unsettling than brutality. This was not theatrical generosity. This was industrial normalcy applied to prisoners. Some of the same men had come from a military culture that equated hardness with truth. If something was rough, it was real. If something was generous, it was suspect. American abundance therefore presented itself at first as moral confusion. The guards were not saints. The camps were not paradises. But the system did not require hatred to function. One American remembered a prisoner saying he liked it in the United States because no one was shooting at him. It sounds almost too simple, but war often collapses philosophy into bare conditions: bread, heat, silence, not being shot at. Outside the wire, this treatment sometimes angered Americans. Civilians on the home front lived under rationing. Families had sons overseas. Some communities resented the sense that enemy soldiers were being coddled while American dead crossed oceans in flag-draped silence. In Alabama, where roughly 16,000 German POWs were housed in 24 camps, local resentment could be sharp enough to leave a record. Yet camp life was so comparatively comfortable that one German prisoner described it as a golden cage, a phrase that survived because it carried both halves of the truth. It was still captivity, but it was captivity made bearable by order, food, and routine. The phrase matters. A cage is a cage, even when painted gold. But the gold was not ornamental, it was institutional. It consisted of calories, hot water, dental care, and the mundane dignity of systems that worked. Former POW Hans Waker later recalled of American camp life, "Our treatment was excellent. Many POWs complained about being POWs, no girlfriends, no contact with family. But the food was excellent and clothing adequate." Another prisoner called camp life a sort of golden cage. That is not the language of men still seeing the world through pure ideological certainty. It is the language of men whose categories have begun to bend. For enlisted prisoners, the experience often deepened on work details. The U.S. government leased out as many as 265,000 POWs to fill labor shortages, especially in agriculture and food processing. Farmers paid the government 45 cents an hour per prisoner, while the men themselves received 80 cents a day in camp scrip. Across Nebraska, Kansas, Alabama, Texas, and elsewhere, captured Germans harvested crops, stacked hay, repaired fences, cut timber, canned produce, packed meat, and stepped into the absence left by American men fighting overseas. They entered not only fields but households, hearing children laugh, seeing porches lit in the evening, and encountering a rural American life that bore no resemblance to the grotesque caricatures. They had been fed. Some American children remembered German prisoners bringing them candy and gum. That detail has the softness of anecdote, but it reveals something profound. Men captured as enemies had not only been fed. Some had been given enough access to the rhythms of civilian life that they began passing sweetness to children on farms half a world away from the ideology that had sent them to war. One Nebraska witness recalled exactly that. They played games with us and brought us candy and gum. In another age, such a sentence would sound like invention. In wartime America, it became part of the record. Yet the story was never simply one of humane treatment dissolving fanaticism in warm light. The camps also carried the war inside them. American authorities had been slow to understand that German prisoners did not arrive as a blank gray mass. Many of the earliest arrivals from North Africa, especially among the Afrika Korps, were intensely disciplined and often deeply indoctrinated. The United States initially failed to segregate committed Nazis from anti-Nazis or the merely apolitical. That mistake let hardcore believers dominate internal camp life. In some camps, pro-Nazi spokesmen gained authority, controlled pressure inside the wire, and terrorized dissenters through threats, beatings, intimidation, and what one historian described as kangaroo courts and Gestapo methods. Between late 1943 and spring 1944, violence inside American POW camps included murders and forced suicides. So the officers at breakfast were not merely tasting food. They were participating in an ideological struggle the Americans themselves had not yet fully grasped. Within the compounds, a man could receive salmon toast in the morning and be pressured by fanatics in the afternoon. He could eat better than he had at the front and still fear being marked as politically unreliable by fellow prisoners. American abundance alone did not create freedom inside the wire. It created the conditions under which freedom might become thinkable. That is the distinction that matters. The meal did not convert them. It destabilized them, because what the officers had expected from America was vulgar plenty, without seriousness. What they encountered, slowly, was something more dangerous to totalitarian belief, abundance connected to procedure, law, and confidence. Not perfect justice, not innocent power, but a system secure enough to extend rules to enemies. For men raised inside a regime that glorified force, this could look at first like weakness. But after enough weeks behind wire, weakness should have revealed itself somewhere. It did not. The trains kept arriving. The kitchens kept serving. The guards rotated. The paperwork multiplied. The nation that had fed them also built bombers, sent divisions abroad, and never looked hungry. The salmon toast returned in memory because it condensed that whole contradiction into one edible image. Bread from industrial agriculture. fish preserved by mass production, coffee carried through global shipping, heat, metal, logistics, fuel, labor, and administration meeting on a tray. In another country, at another moment, it might have been nothing. Here it was the Republic made visible. For some German officers, the deeper humiliation came not from being starved by a conqueror, but from being well fed by one. Hunger can preserve hatred. Adequate food invites comparison. Comparison is fatal to myth. If the enemy is decadent, why is his prison functional? If democracy is chaotic, why do its camps run on schedule? If the American people are weak, why do even captured Germans note the endless automobiles, the intact towns, the barns full of tools, the shelves of canteens, the easy presence of things that in Europe had become rare enough to dream about? This question did not remain only at the level of material life. The Americans, belatedly but deliberately, built programs meant to challenge Nazi ideology among German POWs. The effort that emerged, often grouped under re-education or intellectual diversion, tried to expose prisoners to democratic institutions, uncensored news, literature, films, lectures, music, and courses in civics and history. One statement of purpose described the goal as encouraging an attitude of respect for American institutions, traditions, and ways of life, and correcting misinformation and prejudices surviving. Nazi conditioning through selected facts made available in literature, motion pictures, newspapers, music, art, and educational courses. In practice, that meant a campaign against the mind by means gentler than the war itself, but no less purposeful. Nazi-approved reading matter was reduced. Other books entered the compounds. Educational opportunities expanded. Anti-Nazi or less ideological prisoners found spaces, however imperfect, to breathe. Newspapers like Der Ruf sought to reach German readers in their own language. The project was uneven, often resisted, and never universally successful. Even supporters admitted it did not transform everyone. But it mattered because it recognized that the wire enclosed not only bodies, but worldviews. And here the food remained relevant. Ideas do not float above physical life. A man who is constantly cold and hungry becomes less reachable by books than by bread. American administrators, chaplains, teachers, and some guards understood, sometimes instinctively, sometimes strategically, that humane treatment made ideological challenge possible. One recollection framed the logic clearly. The Americans wanted to demonstrate that democratic life was superior to dictatorship. That superiority could not be proved by pamphlet alone. It had to be embodied in conditions. The officers learned this before they were ready to name it. They learned it in the small embarrassments. In discovering that the coffee was real coffee. In finding bathrooms that functioned, medical, staff who treated disease, and laundries that returned clothing. In watching enlisted men return from farm details with stories not of beatings, but of table food, chores, children, orchards, and Midwestern weather. In hearing that farmers paid for labor, but that even within captivity there existed wages, canteen purchases, books, sports, and mail. It was a prison camp, yet it touched the edges of civil society. Some held out longer than others. Ideology rarely breaks all at once. It frays. A man may keep saluting inwardly long after he has stopped believing. He may preserve nationalism after losing faith in the state that weaponized it. He may accept American efficiency while still hating America. In the camps, there were committed Nazis to the end. Men who bullied others, rejected re-education, treated every sign of fairness as manipulation, and waited for history to rescue their faith. The American side knew this well enough that especially hardcore Nazis were separated to camps such as Alva, Oklahoma. But many others underwent a quieter change, one less dramatic than renunciation and therefore more historically believable. They did not wake one morning reborn as Democrats. They accumulated doubts. The world outside the barbed wire contradicted too much. The American guards were often ordinary men, sometimes indifferent, sometimes decent, sometimes clumsy, but not the racial caricatures of propaganda. The camps themselves were not exterminatory spaces. The nation beyond them did not resemble the diseased fantasy of Nazi broadcasts. And the war, as news filtered through, no longer obeyed the promises Berlin had made. Then came the larger reckoning. After VE Day, many prisoners were forced to confront evidence of the concentration camps and the crimes of the regime they had served. Film footage of liberated camps, skeletal survivors, pits of bodies, ovens, striped cloth, and emaciated faces confronted men who had long protected themselves with ignorance, denial, or selective not knowing. For some, this was the true breaking point. The same America that had served food equal to its own soldiers now compelled them to look at what stood at the far end of the ideology they had defended. Humane treatment was not sentimental. It was paired, eventually, with moral indictment. In that light, the salmon toast acquires another meaning. At first, it symbolized abundance. Later, it symbolized contrast. A government that could feed enemies and still force them to witness atrocity was making an argument larger than military victory. It was saying, power need not consume all restraint. Law need not vanish in war. The treatment of prisoners is not a sentimental footnote, but a statement about what a nation believes itself to be. Of course, America in wartime was not morally simple. The same home front that hosted German prisoners also contained internment, exclusion, segregation, and contradiction. Democracy has always been easier to praise in abstraction. Somewhere beyond the wire, a truck changed gears. Somewhere, in the kitchen, another batch of bread came up under cloth. Somewhere a clerk stamped forms, a guard yawned, a cook cursed, and a republic at war continued the unglamorous labor of being materially vast. They had expected prison to reduce them to pure resentment. Instead, it forced them into observation. The bread was white. The coffee was hot. The fish was real. The wire remained. Both things were true. In time, many of these men went home to a Germany of rubble, shortages, black markets, and silence. Some returned carrying not gratitude exactly, but comparison. Some carried shame. Some carried confusion. Some wrote letters back to American families who had known them as laborers in fields and barns. Some even returned to the United States later in life, pulled back by memory, by affection, or by the need to measure the distance between who they had been and what they had seen. Former POW Hans Weicker, who had been held in Nebraska, eventually returned to America and remembered his treatment as excellent. Such returns do not erase war, but they mark transformation of another sort, the enemy becoming witness. If freedom has a sound, history often tells it through speeches, declarations, and bells. But sometimes freedom announces itself more quietly. Sometimes it is the scrape of a tray on a mess table, the crack of toast, the low murmur of a kitchen in the dark before dawn. Sometimes it is the fact that a powerful nation does not need to humiliate every captive to prove that it has won. Sometimes democracy is not first encountered in a ballot or a constitution, but in the stubborn material abundance that makes law seem credible, because life, even under strain, still works. That is why the memory endures, not because salmon toast won the war, not because food alone and to practice without stain. But historical reality becomes meaningful precisely when two truths coexist. The United States could fail some of its own ideals and still present to many captured Germans, a political and material order profoundly unlike the one they had served. To deny either side is to make history smaller than it was. What changed in those officers, then, was not only their opinion of American food. It was their sense of what strength looked like. In the Nazi imagination, strength shouted, starved, sorted, and crushed. In Kansas, strength arrived as procedure, warehousing, payrolls, dentistry, inspections, coffee urns, and a breakfast tray warm in winter. The men who had worshipped hardness found themselves disarmed by competence. The Republic did not need to scream at them to dominate them. It only had to keep functioning. There was, too, the pain of resemblance. The food on the tray felt dangerously close to home. That may be the title's deepest truth. Not that American rations literally duplicated German domestic cuisine, but that warmth, bread, fish, and routine touched a memory beneath ideology. Long before these officers had served the Reich, they had been boys in kitchens, sons at tables, men who knew the ordinary consolation of food placed before them by a world that still made sense. War had torn that sense apart. In camp, a meal could briefly restore the form of home while denying the political universe they had attached to it. That is why it was unsettling. The toast felt familiar. The country serving it did not. And so the officers sat in the cold barracks light, shoulders squared from habit, eating slowly, as if suspicious of their own appetite. Outside, The prairie wind moved over Kansas fields where American farms waited for spring, defeated ideology. But because for a few moments in a frozen camp on the Kansas plain, captured German officers looked down at an ordinary American ration and felt something ideology had not prepared them for. Not fear, not hatred, but recognition. The enemy's bread was warm. The enemy's coffee was honest. The enemy had enough to feed even those who had come to destroy him. And that may be one of the larger truths of the century. Tyrannies promise greatness in banners, marches, and steel, yet so often leave their own people hungry. Free societies, for all their noise and imperfection, sometimes reveal their deepest strength in the plainest things. A stocked kitchen, a lawful restraint, a meal served without frenzy, an order robust enough to let abundance reach even the defeated. On that winter morning, in the steam rising from salmon on toast, a few officers glimpsed that truth before they had words for it. The meal disappeared. The idea remained.